Did Craig Ellis murder his mother Nanette? That's a question that most of you already think you know the answer to. Whether you think he did or whether you think he didn't, people seem to have very strong opinions when it comes to Craig and what he did or didn't do. So in this video, I'm going to look a little deeper into Craig and see if anybody changes their mind one way or the other by the end of it. And before you start running off to the courthouse to start proceedings against me, just watch until the end. There's the disclaimer as usual, extremely important today because there will be a lot of opinions flying around because we don't have a lot of actual facts, so we have to fill in the blanks with opinions and theories. I read something the other day that really stuck in my mind and made me start thinking about Craig. It said that when a horrific event occurs, like the murder of a beautiful innocent woman like Nanette, people need someone to blame. It's just human nature. And I thought about it and I thought, is that why I've always been interested in unsolved murders? More so the unsolved ones than the solved ones. I always thought it was because I'm nosy and I need to know everything, like I really need to know. And that's probably part of it. But is it also because I need someone to blame? Whenever I hear about a murder, it makes me mad. The first thing I think of is, who the hell did that? Who the hell thought he could walk into someone's home, somebody's sacred place, the place where they should feel the safest, and take their life? Like, who the fuck are you? You've invaded their private space. You've terrified them beyond belief. You've taken them away from family, children, friends, colleagues. You've made sure that they're not able to do any of the goals or the dreams that they had for themselves. You've taken everything and you've left a legacy of loss and sadness. I mean, the absolute audacity. I mean, I want to know who you are because I need someone to blame. So yeah, I think that statement is true. And in this case, that need to blame has fallen mostly on Craig. The thing I read said that blaming a family member is actually a well-known phenomenon in cold case psychology. When there is no suspect, and especially when there's no suspect after all this time as well, and there's no forced entry, and there's no clear offender, investigations and public opinion tend to default to family members because they are accessible, they fit statistical patterns, they remain emotionally present, but behavioural evidence often contradicts that assumption. Now, some people think it was Brian. We've talked about that before in a recent video. Some people think witches are involved. That's an upcoming video, by the way. But most people I've spoken to think it was Craig. Why? Well, he's the easy choice, isn't he? When I first started looking into this, I've said this a few times, Nanette's world seemed very small. But we've since come to learn that she actually had a large circle of people around her. But at the start, there seemed to be very few people it could have been, especially if we were thinking that it wasn't a stranger, that it was someone known to her. And after the first video, I got a lot of, oh yeah, that was Craig, and Craig did it. Like people saying it like that was a fact. And I can understand why people thought that. Like for one, Craig was the last person to be at the house that day. He benefited financially from Nanette's death. He came home while the tyre on her car was still hissing, but he didn't see anyone. He wasn't home each time the car was vandalised, and he was on holidays from work when all the rocks were thrown. He did some weird stuff, like taking off and leaving his brother with the neighbour. He left the house empty when he knew Nanette was going to be home soon. He used his mother's death to get out of a speeding ticket. The "I did love you" in his obituary was a tad odd. I mean, I've seen people go to jail for less circumstantial evidence than this. So I understand why he was a top suspect on a lot of people's lists. And throwing in that needing to blame someone as well, he's an easy target. He's the perfect suspect. But could he have done it? So let's look at the evidence that we actually know of. Okay, Greg said that when he came back from the shop and fed the cat, it was about 4:20 p.m. He then helped Craig with the mud flap, which only took a few minutes, and then he went down to the Hutchisons down the road. So I'd say he left at about 4:30 p.m. He said that Craig was still home when he left. Are these actual facts? Well, we really don't know. I would say that Greg's statement about the time he left the Hutchinsons to go home is accurate because he had more than one person there who could verify that. But as for the time when he left, well, there are no other accounts of Greg leaving at around 4:30 p.m. But for this video, let's pretend we believe him and he did actually leave at 4:30. I don't know why Greg would lie about what time he left anyway, because Greg's right down the bottom of the list on the suspect list, of course. I think everybody knows that. I don't really think that Greg had anything to do with it. And if it turns out that Greg did have something to do with it, I will be so surprised. Okay, so he's left the house at around 4:30 and Nanette has arrived home at around 5:15. Now, we have a witness placing her in her driveway at that time, and I don't know what reason the witness would have to lie. That gives Craig 45 minutes to leave. As far as I know, Craig has not publicly said what time he left, but based on other statements, we know it's sometime in those 45 minutes. He said he went to show off his car to his friends, and he's come back to shower and change at, I would say, around 6:10 p.m. And I say that because Greg found Nanette's body at 6. He's run back to the neighbours and come back, which would have taken around 2 minutes. So Craig would have had to come back sometime after about 6:05, but before the ambulance and police arrived. So I'll say it was probably around about 6:10, although I don't know for sure. Okay, so that means he could have been gone for an hour and 45 minutes, or he could have been gone for an hour. He could have also killed her when she got home and then left, but the police have ruled him out. I doubt it was through DNA. We've already gone through that, so I'm assuming they ruled him out through his friends. We don't know what the friends said or how many friends they even were or who these friends were. We know nothing about the friends. But it was obviously enough for the police to believe that he didn't have the time to do it, which means that the friends must have said that he was with them before 5:15. So we've gone over this stuff before. Could Craig have done it given the timeline? But what we haven't gone over before is, could Craig have done it like from an actual physical standpoint, like mentally, emotionally? Like, is he capable mentally, physically, emotionally of committing a crime such as this? Not everyone can kill someone, even if they snap and go off. I mean, remember, Nanette was chased through the house. Well, I believe she was chased through the house. I've already done a video on what I believed happened, and I know that's not a fact, but I think based on the evidence, it might be pretty close. It's one thing to snap and lunge at someone, but it's another to continue the assault. Remember, there were scratches on the back of her head. I mean, he might have kept swinging as she was running. He wanted her dead, and that's a different psychology altogether. So I did a little bit of research into criminal profiling. It was actually really interesting, but I'll tell you what I came up with and you tell me in the comments if it sounds like Craig. Now, keep in mind that this is just research that I found and I'm not a professional profiler in any way. If there is a professional profiler in the audience, let us know in the comments if I'm correct or if I'm way off. Okay, so I'm just going to read all this stuff like from my notes. Okay, so apparently the multiple stab wounds, especially to the head and the neck, indicate intense rage, an emotional fixation on the victim, and a desire to silence, dominate, or destroy identity. Now, could that be Craig? Did he have an intense rage or emotional fixation on Nanette? The desire to silence, maybe. We don't know if she knew something about him that he didn't want out. But would that have caused intense rage? I doubt he was emotionally fixated. What do you think? The movement through the house, the chase, indicates that the attacker was determined to complete the act, not flee. So that rules out a robbery. Apparently, most robbers would leave the house when confronted by a resident. So that keeps in line with the it wasn't a stranger theory that most of us have. And the fact that he was determined to complete the act, that doesn't sound like someone who went into a rage, like just snapped into a rage. Unless he's gone into a rage, attacked her, then realised what he's done and thought, well, I can't let her live now, I'll go to jail. And that kind of does fit in with how I thought it happened. The reason why she ran out the back door as well. In case you haven't watched that video, I thought she may have been knocked unconscious by the blow to the head. He's freaked out and gone into the kitchen, which is why there was blood in there. Then he's come back and she's regained consciousness. he's now blocking the door from the hallway into the lounge room, so she can't go out the front, so she's run out the back door. This would also fit my version because it doesn't seem premeditated to me if they had to use Craig's knife. They obviously didn't come to the house with weapons. Unless they did come to the house with weapons and then they saw Craig's knife and thought that would do a better job. Okay, the extended pursuit through multiple rooms shows relentless determination, goal-directed violence, not a sudden explosion followed by retreat. This offender was committed to killing her, not lashing out briefly. There was no theft, so that doesn't seem like it was financially motivated. Now, I hear you saying, but Craig inherited money. Yes, he did. But if he was going to kill his mother for money, this wasn't really the best way to go about it. It took a while before he saw any of it after it went through probate. Probate wasn't granted to her sister until January 1985. I guess that's not too long to wait, but still, it seems a bit much. Okay, the undone button on her jeans. This part's a bit tricky. It seems like it wasn't primarily sexually motivated, but the undone button could suggest a possible attempt at a sexual assault, or it could have been staged to look like it was an attempt at a sexual assault, or, and this is interesting because this hasn't come up before, it could have been a struggle artifact, meaning that it could have been pulled open or come open during the struggle. Apparently, this happens. We know Nanette fought for her life, so it's quite possible that her button came undone in the struggle. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. The next thing is the vandalism, and this is assuming that the vandalism is connected to the murder. As you may already know, I think the vandalism in the driveway was related, but I'm not convinced about the rocks down Burwood Highway. The vandalism before a homicide suggests targeted harassment, fixation, and escalating behaviour patterns. And this strongly indicates someone known to the victim or someone who had been observing her, and we already sort of knew that. The timing of the attack, her just arriving home from work when she was attacked, implies the offender knew her routine and was either watching and waiting or knew her schedule intimately. Now, this suggests an acquaintance or a former partner, a co-worker, a neighbour, a regular service contact, or someone who had studied her movements. Now, Craig definitely knew her routine intimately. He said that she called him that day and basically told him exactly what she was going to be doing that night. So that part doesn't look good for him. But then there was a lot of other people who also knew her routine quite intimately too. So from all that, it says that this killing shows signs of personal grievance, emotional fixation, possessiveness, and rejection sensitivity. Now, when we look at that, does that look like Craig? Personal grievance maybe, but we don't know that for sure. It's possible, but I haven't heard anything to say that he had a grievance. Emotional fixation, I don't think so. Possessiveness, why would he be possessive? Rejection sensitivity, he's not being rejected by his mother. I could say, well, he might have done something to make her pull away, but it just doesn't seem like that to me. I mean, she called him that day. She was driving around with him and getting chicken for dinner. I can't remember off the top of my head if that was the night before or the Thursday before. Must have been the Thursday before because it was after he had washed off the paint and fixed up the tyres and everything. But from everything I've heard, it just doesn't seem like Craig fits that profile. The profile also says that it's a low probability that this was a stranger, which we knew. Well, we don't know, but this is what we have suspected all along. And a high probability of a prior connection. Now, possible suspects include former romantic partner, rejected suitor, a co-worker with a fixation, a neighbour, or an acquaintance who developed an obsession. Now, I find that interesting because I think she's probably got one of each of these. Former romantic partner, that would be Max, but we know that he didn't do it. Co-worker with a fixation, maybe, we don't know. Neighbour, yep, but I want to do a different video on the neighbours, so I'll leave that there right now. Acquaintance who developed an obsession, Brian, and a rejected suitor. Even though we don't know of any, who's saying there wasn't? I mean, if someone hit on her and she declined their advances, she probably wouldn't have given it a second thought. So maybe she just didn't tell anyone. Or maybe she didn't tell anyone because it happened all the time. I can imagine there would have been a lot of interest in Nanette from men. But let's go back and look at some of this again, because I've written all this down, but then I've actually mixed it up a little bit. So some things might be discussed twice, but like the no forced entry. This strongly supports she voluntarily opened the door and she recognized and trusted the person, at least initially. And when I read that kind of horrifies me, because I can imagine her opening the door thinking, this person standing on my doorstep is not somebody that I should be afraid of. I know that somebody is out there vandalizing my car and trying to make me scared, and I know that I'm scared enough to put weapons by the door, and I'm scared enough to have people sleep over at my house, and I'm scared enough to get police, and police are scared enough, they're saying don't be in the house alone. So obviously, you're afraid of someone, but then this person's like, well, this is not this person. She trusted and recognized this person initially and said it was okay to let them in the house, and she was completely wrong. If it happened like that, like this, I'm just reading like what I got from all the research that I did. But the loud radio, apparently the loud radio was very important behaviorally, because turning up the radio loudly suggests an intent to mask sound, a premeditation or rapid situational awareness, a desire to muffle screams, mask noise of a violent struggle, or create cover for extended violence. So this is not impulsive panic behavior. It indicates someone thinking during the crime. Now that leads towards an offender with forethought and emotional detachment sufficient to manage the scene. So think about that. But that part there though is only if the offender turned that radio on. We've discussed the radio before. We've discussed the fact that Nanette may have put it on herself. But I think we came to the conclusion that if Nanette had put it on herself, then there was probably somebody else at home with her. Or, like what I said, someone she initially trusted. Because I doubt she would have put that on herself if she were home alone. Also, I asked if she had opened the door for someone, why was she not attacked by the front door? Why was it, up the hallway near the bedroom? So apparently, if an attack is opportunistic or robbery related or a stranger intrusion, it would most often begin at the point of entry near the front door and in common areas like the living room. Now, at the point of entry, near the front door, in common areas like the living room, that's all in the same spot in Nanette's house and most people's houses, I think. But the fact that this did not happen suggests that there was movement into the home before the violence began. And that implies trust, familiarity, or internal presence. It actually also said that her attacker was likely blocking her path to the front door, like after the initial attack, of course. Which is what I have thought all along. Okay, so here's the part where it describes who the actual killer is. Now, these are the likely character traits based on basically the whole thing that happened, the stabbing, the being alone, all that sort of stuff, all the stuff that we know. This is what the likely character traits are. Very high probability that it was a male. Okay. Age is likely 25 to 50. Age likely 25 to 50, that rules out Craig right there. Emotionally volatile, poor emotional regulation, obsessive tendencies, difficulty coping with rejection, externalizes blame, feels the victim caused their emotional pain. So that's looking less and less likely to me that it's Craig. Like, what do you think? That just doesn't sound... I mean, I don't know the guy, and I certainly didn't know him when he was 18 years old. But also, too, you've got to remember, he was 18 years old. He's a child. And there's nothing that I've read or in any reports or anything or any research that I've done or nothing I've heard from the many, many, many people who have contacted me over the last couple of years that would suggest that describes Craig. Right? And this is important too. So behavioral indicators before the crime. Okay, so would be what this person would be acting like before they actually committed this crime. Okay, So likely behaviours prior to the crime would be surveillance of her home, monitoring her movements, prior unwanted contact, harassment, stalking behaviours, property damage, which we know there was property damage, of course, and threats or intimidation. And post-offence behaviour predictions. Now listen to this carefully, because I want everyone who knew Nanette to really think about who was displaying these behaviours after her murder, right? After the homicide, this type of offender often closely follows news coverage, talks about the case obsessively, inserts themselves into discussions, displays emotional reactions inconsistent with casual acquaintances, meaning that, if he's casual acquaintance, he's like a lot more upset than what a casual acquaintance would be. And he may attend vigils, funerals, or community gatherings. Now, wouldn't that be really interesting to be able to get a list of everyone who attended her funeral? I mean, it's probable, highly likely, that the person who killed her was in that church. If it was a church. I don't know if it was a church or a funeral home. But wherever her funeral was held, it's a high percentage that the killer was sitting among all the mourners. I wonder if police even bothered to get a list. I don't know. But did this just make you think of someone in particular? If it did, my email is in the description. All right, so what all this says is that this murder is consisted with a targeted, emotionally driven homicide by a known individual with escalating fixation. Okay, not a random attack, not an opportunistic burglary, not a sex crime. So he's still thinking it was Craig. Well, after I did some research to try to identify the type of killer, I kept researching to see if I could actually link Craig. Not because I want him to have done it and I'm obsessed and I just want to prove that it's him. Not because of that at all. But mainly because I want to see, could he have done it, And I was hoping at the start of the research that I would get to the end and go, no, I don't believe that Craig did it. Because I don't want to think that somebody that Nanette loved that much could do this to her. So, but I did keep going to see, could Craig be linked to any of this? Because at this point, I'm thinking no. Or at the very least, not bloody likely. All right? So, factors that supported the theory that it was Craig is proximity, presence in the house, and the statistical likelihood in domestic homicides. Of course, but that's pretty broad. Okay, but there are several major factors that did contradict it. And one of them was like the overkill. Children who kill parents typically use a single weapon, and it's usually short duration violence. And then there's a panic aftermath and often very poor staging. So this crime, though, shows a sustained attack, a prolonged pursuit, strategic behaviour if you're counting that the offender turned the radio on. That is the strategic behaviour if he turned the radio on. If Nanette turned it on herself, then that part doesn't matter. But there was also directional movement control, and that leans away from impulsive family violence. Okay, the radio use is a huge problem for the theory that it could be Craig. And this is why. Because an 18-year-old killing in rage does not typically think to turn up a radio, mask the sound, and manage auditory detection. Okay, so if the offender did turn the radio on, probably not likely to be Craig in an impulsive rage. Okay, this behaviour does strongly suggest someone who was accustomed to concealment or planning. And another big thing that just doesn't fit Craig is the prior car vandalism. I mean, if he was the threat, why vandalise her car at all? Why escalate externally instead of internally? This actually fits stalking and intimidation escalation, not a domestic conflict. This is also one that I found really interesting as well, the attack method and the focus on the head and the neck area. This kind of attack method with a focus on the head and the neck typically reflects obsessive rage, identity annihilation, and a personal grievance. And what I found interesting is that most of the time when children kill their parents, they usually target the torso and the chest and the abdomen, not the face, neck, and head. This is more typical of rejected suitors, stalkers, and obsessive fixations. Also, with the length and the nature of the struggle, this was not a sudden blow up, a brief confrontation, or a momentary loss of control. Now, when you put it like that too, then maybe it's not Brian either, I don't know. But this was a relentless pursuit across multiple rooms with continued stabbing while she attempted to escape. And that suggests a determination to kill, not an emotional explosion. And just as I say that too, I want to remind everybody that this is just what I found from digging around textbooks and on the internet and stuff like that. So this might not be correct. Because although someone may have gone there to kill Nanette, I still can't wrap my head around the fact that they thought it was Craig's knife. But maybe it wasn't even Craig's knife. I mean, this was just something that the police said when it first happened. I mean, just because they found it missing doesn't mean that is the murder weapon. And like I said, they could have come there with their own weapon and then saw that knife there and thought it was a better fit for them. But anyway, back to the going through the multiple rooms and the continued stabbing while she attempted to escape. They said that even highly emotional family killings usually show shorter durations, a collapse after the initial attack, and panic, but not pursuit. It also says that the pre-attack escalation, the car vandalism, like the property damage, intimidation to the homicide, are classic stalker fixation trajectories. They are not typical of sudden domestic violence or parent-child conflict. It says for Craig to fit this theory, we would need to assume that he vandalized her car without confrontation, without escalation inside the home, without earlier known violence, and that is behaviourally uncommon. And the question is, was there any evidence of prior conflict or volatility or violence between Craig and Nanette? Because sudden extreme violence without a long escalation pattern inside the relationship is rare, whereas escalation outside the home with vandalism and intimidation fits obsessive offenders very well. So now we'll look at each of the parts and we'll compare them between Craig and an obsessive outsider. Okay, so no forced entry. Well, that fits Craig because he lives there, but it also fits if it was a trusted acquaintance that was allowed inside. The radio playing loudly fits if Craig was there because that's normal household activity. Also fits if the victim turned it on. The attack beginning near the bedroom, it fits with Craig because it's an internal household confrontation. It also fits with an obsessive outsider because the confrontation happened like after she entered but moved down the hallway. Sustained pursuit through the house, less typical to be Craig because family violence is usually short-lived. Highly typical that it was an obsessive outsider with determination and a fixation on Nanette. Okay, the extreme overkill with the head and the neck stabbing is less typical for it to be Craig because parent killings rarely target the face and neck, and highly typical for an obsessive outsider because it's symbolic annihilation and rage fixation. Now, the car vandalism prior to this happening is a very poor fit for Craig because it requires like a secret harassment campaign and he lives there. It's weird, but it's a strong fit for an obsessive outsider because it is classic stalking escalation. And the no robbery, no sexual assault, neutral to be the son, but a strong fit for an obsessive outsider because it's emotionally driven homicide. The timing of just arrived home is neutral for Craig, but a strong fit for an obsessive outsider because the offender was either waiting, knew the routine, or, came in after she had already gone inside. And the blood drops towards the front door, slightly favours an outsider exit pattern. So which theory requires the fewer assumptions? Now, to think that it was Craig, it requires assuming that he vandalised her car without detection, that he hid escalating hostility without overt conflict, that he suddenly exploded into extreme overkill, that he engaged in unusually prolonged pursuit, and that he demonstrated atypical violence patterns for family homicide. So that's multiple things that you have to assume to say that it was Craig, which is a little bit up there. But with an obsessive outsider, this requires assuming that she trusted someone enough to open the door and she may have underestimated the risk. So that's only two assumptions, which are both extremely common in real-world cases. So when you do a behavioural probability weighting, which isn't certainty because it's just a probability estimation based on known violent behaviour patterns, it came out to be the chances of an obsessive outsider 65 to 75%, and for Craig being about 25%. And if the car vandalism is definitively linked to the homicide, the outsider probability rises to 80 to 90%. Now, the psychology for it to be Craig would have to involve long-standing resentment, an explosive argument, a trigger event, a sudden loss of control, and then panic afterwards. But this crime shows a sustained attack, extended pursuit, repeated stabbing, and no collapse of aggression. So it doesn't align with impulsive rage patterns. But for the obsessive outsider, it would typically involve fixation, fantasy rehearsal, escalating intimidation, grievance building, emotional justification, and rage execution. And this aligns very tightly with the prior vandalism, the overkill, the targeted violence, and the extended pursuit. The targeting of the head and the neck strongly suggests a desire to obliterate identity, symbolic dominance, and intense emotional fixation. And this is far more common in rejected lovers, obsessive stalkers, and spurned suitors than in a parent-child violence situation. So the most behaviourally coherent narrative would be a male acquaintance, fixated emotionally, harassed her, escalated through vandalism, felt rejected or humiliated, confronted her, lost emotional control, and committed a rage-driven homicide. And this narrative explains the vandalism, the overkill, the attack style, the pursuit, the timing, and the fear-based victim behaviour with minimal assumptions. Now, this probability would shift if there were signs that showed that with Craig, there was prior documented violence, or there was severe conflict, or if there were threats from Craig, police involvement, or known instability, then that would kind of change the probability balance. But does anybody know if any of those things will fit Craig? From what I know, I would not say that there was anything like that coming from him. And if none of that stuff fits Craig, which I strongly think that it doesn't, then the behaviour strongly favours the outsider fixation. And then if we're looking at the outsider, the obsessive outsider, what this says about him is that he didn't stop. He didn't stop after the initial wounding. He didn't panic and flee. He didn't break off the attack. He pursued her through multiple rooms. And this is highly diagnostic of a goal-driven homicide, not an emotional explosion. So psychologically as well, this offender did not disengage, he did not pause, he did not retreat. He was committed to the outcome. Now it says, in behavioural profiling, this is one of the strongest indicators of premeditated or fantasized violence, even if the exact timing was impulsive. So it's basically saying that even if at the time he didn't plan on murdering Nanette, then, he still could have done it at that time without it being like a big emotional explosion. And that kind of also fits with the fact that it could have been Craig's knife then, because this person could have fantasized about killing Nanette, could have wanted to kill Nanette, but he's come around. He hasn't had any sort of like, I'm going to do it now. But then he's changed his mind when he's got them in there. That means that he didn't bring the weapons with him. But once he's in there, he's like, no, I'm going to do it now. And he's grabbed Craig's knife. There's also something interesting about the psychology of someone who chases a wounded victim. We know that Nanette was already quite wounded in the hallway. There was a lot of blood there. But that also could have just come from one knock onto the head. But she obviously was wounded. And chasing a wounded victim is deeply about power, control, domination, and emotional annihilation. And it's not necessarily about achieving death, it is about ensuring it. And this fits an obsessive grievance-based homicide. And why this all weakens the case against Craig, because in parent-child homicides, the most common patterns are single location violence, a short duration, emotional explosion, and a panic withdrawal. It is rare to see a multi-room pursuit, a continued stabbing during flight, and an exit route interception, and a final collapse after extended escape attempt. This requires sustained intent, emotional endurance, and cognitive control, which is much more typical of obsessive grievance offenders. It also says that the way that it all happened, that it seemed like Nanette realized very early that this person intended to kill her, not just to harm her, but to kill her. And that says that it was not a normal argument and that it was not a familiar domestic conflict. And like I said before, reading that sort of stuff kind of like made me a little bit, because I thought, did Nanette realize that this was the person who had been making her so afraid? I mean, did she let this person in because she wasn't afraid of them, hence the lack of forced entry? And then something he has said or done has made her realize that, oh, wait a second, this is the person who's been doing this to me. And I really hope not, because to me that is way more terrifying than just being sprung upon. I mean, imagine letting somebody in that you think, I'm not afraid of this person because I know this person, I trust this person. I don't think this person is any threat to me whatsoever. And just imagine that second when you realize, oh my God, this is the person who has been harassing me all this time and scaring me so much that I needed police protection and I needed to put weapons by my door. And the way that she must have felt when she realized I'm in the house alone with this person. That actually gives me the creeps and actually makes me more determined to find out who the hell this asshole is. But, all of this, though, doesn't really sound like Craig, does it? Well, that's what I was thinking at this point anyway. But then I thought, well, some people have said that Nanette may have walked in on Craig doing something. So I wondered if that could have caused a more of a loss of control reaction and more of an overkill in the attack. So then I thought, okay, so let's see if it fits. Okay, so you got sudden extreme violence. It fits shock, panic, loss of emotional control. The prolonged pursuit, doesn't really fit because panic-based violence usually explodes suddenly, peaks quickly, then collapses into shock or withdrawal. A sustained pursuit suggests continued emotional fuel, not just a momentary fear, and a drive to ensure the outcome. So apparently this doesn't rule it out, but it makes the scenario psychologically more complex. And the car vandalism is the biggest problem for the Craig theory, because to maintain that Craig did it, we must assume that either the vandalism was unrelated, and like I said, I think the rock throwing was unrelated, but I don't think that the vandalism in the front yard was unrelated. I think that was related. Or we have to assume that he just vandalized her car for unknown reasons. So it doesn't really fit, does it? I mean, if he's in his room and she's come home and she's walked in, she's seen him doing something and he's just like freaked out, like, oh, I don't want her to tell people, or I'm upset that she even knows, or whatever the reason. He's thought, he's kind of like, and kind of attacked her. That doesn't explain why the hell he would vandalize her car the week before on multiple occasions. It just doesn't fit. Also, if there was something that Craig felt shame about, or felt like he needed to keep secret, or he had a fear of exposure about. Like, for that theory to work, the internal psychological pressure must have already been enormous. And this level of violence that happened to Nanette doesn't come from mild embarrassment or moderate fear or your typical teenage secrecy. It comes from existential level panic. Now, Nanette loved her boys. I have no doubt about that. Even though I never knew Nanette, I don't know Craig and I don't know Greg, just from what I've heard from other people, I would be really surprised to find out if that Nanette did not love her boys. She loved her boys, okay? I mean, she even wrote letters to Amnesty International. So she doesn't seem to me to be a person who would be so highly judgmental that someone would feel the need to hide a secret from her, like so much that they would actually go to this extent. You know, she doesn't seem to be, well, to me anyway, she doesn't seem to be someone who would make her sons feel like their life was over if she caught them doing something. My son asked me the other day if there was anything that he could do that would make me hate him. And I actually thought about it first. Then I said, no, not a single thing. You may do something that might disappoint me a little, but hate you? No way. So I just don't think this is a caught you in a secret scenario. Okay, so what would Craig have done afterwards if he had committed this attack? And what would an obsessive outsider offender done after they had done this attack? Okay, well, an obsessive outsider would have had an emotional discharge. He would have relief mixed with agitation. He would have had that completion of a fantasy kind of feel. And he would have gone into a rapid shift into self-preservation mode. So immediately after, he would have made a rapid exit from the scene, a quick attempt to leave the neighborhood, avoid witnesses, and dispose of the weapon and clean up any visible blood. He would be at a heightened awareness of detection risk. Now, that night, he would have been hypervigilant. He would have been monitoring news, radio, and police presence. He would have been quite restless, having an inability to sleep. He would have been replaying the event mentally, and he would have had strong emotional swings from relief to anxiety to agitation, back again, or keep going with the circle. Now, in the days and the weeks after, he would have followed the media obsessively. He would have talked about the case more than normal. He would have inserted himself into conversations about the murder. You know, he would have had subtle emotional leakage of excitement, anxiety, and moral justification. And he would have attended any vigils, funerals, or community events while still trying to maintain an outward appearance of normalcy. Now, the way Craig would have been totally different. He would have experienced acute shock, extreme panic, disbelief, cognitive overload, dissociation. This is not predatory psychology, this is trauma psychology. Now, what he would have done immediately after, this is what most kids do immediately after if they murder a parent. Their typical immediate reactions would be to freeze, to be shocked into immobility. He'd have disorganized thinking, he'd be crying, vomiting, pacing, trembling, and have dissociation. There wouldn't be any strategic planning or sophisticated staging or calm escape behaviours. Now, that's interesting because if the button was undone for staging purposes, that is like something that is not likely for a child who killed his parents to do. And we'd also have to assume that if Craig did it, he has, like someone said, that they think the person that did it took clothes out of the wardrobe in the back bedroom to try to get changed or cover up blood or whatever. This doesn't seem to be something that a child who has killed a parent would typically do. And if we're thinking that it's Craig, we have to assume that then he's left the house, he's gone away, he's disposed of the weapon, he's cleaned up any blood, he's done all that sort of stuff, and that's not common for a child who has killed their parent. In fact, for a child who has killed their parent, the most probable sequence right afterwards would be, like after realizing that she is dead or dying, would be shock, standing frozen, staring, not fully processing the reality of it, emotional collapse, crying, panic breathing, possible vomiting, hyperventilation, a fear response like I've destroyed my life, I'm going to prison, everything is over, disorganized attempts to fix the situation like wiping visible blood, washing hands repeatedly, changing clothes, pacing, attempting to clean random spots, which is really interesting because we know that nobody tried to wipe up the blood. There was nobody, it didn't seem to me anyway that there was any point where someone was trying to wipe up the blood. Maybe changing clothes, but, there was also, the spots on the kitchen wall and the spots on the kitchen bench and the spots going out, and none of those were, or it didn't seem to me anyway by looking at the pictures. I mean, I might be wrong, of course, because I'm not an expert, but it didn't seem to me to be any attempt to clean up any of the blood. But these kind of efforts to for a child killing their parent are usually chaotic and incomplete and ineffective. And for the rest of the night, he would not leave the house easily. Why? Because he is young, he is emotionally shattered, he is cognitively overloaded, and he has nowhere safe to go. And leaving requires planning, transportation, and emotional regulation. And, he did have transportation, but did he have the emotional regulation and the planning forethought to go, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to drive off and I'm going to get rid of the weapon and I'm going to make sure that there's no blood on me or no blood in my car, because obviously if I've got blood on me, there might be blood in the car now. And I'm sure the police checked his car. Well, I'm hoping the police checked his car. But most children who kill their parents stay in the house. They're frozen by shock and fear. So he would likely cycle through panic, shock, crying, numbness, fear, catastrophic thinking, and this cycle will just repeat for hours. Sleep would be extremely unlikely. Most would sit awake, pace, cry, disassociate, replay the event mentally, and also have a terrible fear of discovery. So he would likely be physically and emotionally wrecked. And honestly, too, he's probably like that too, just because it was his mum that was murdered as well. So, I mean, you can't even really, look at that and go, yeah, well, that's what happened. I'm sure both him and Greg were physically and emotionally wrecked that night and probably didn't get a lot of sleep. But it might be differentiated by the pacing and the disassociation and the fear of discovery kind of thing. Definitely would not be, I was going to say definitely not being replaying the event mentally if he didn't do it, but he probably also would be. And I'm sure Greg was replaying the event mentally over and over, the event being finding the body, not actually killing her, of course. So some of that kind of still would be what they would have been going through even though they didn't do it. But a child who did kill their parent would probably be displaying physical symptoms like trembling, sweating, nausea, headache, exhaustion, and disorientation. It also said that children who kill their parents either accidentally or impulsively usually have very consistent patterns when it comes to discovering the body. They almost always discover the body themselves. They call emergency services or they wake another family member or seek help within hours. They rarely leave the body undiscovered and go to sleep normally and act composed because the emotional pressure becomes unbearable. So the key behavioural differences after a murder between an obsessive outsider and a son kind of scenario, a son panic scenario, would be their emotional state. The obsessive outsider would have controlled rage and relief, and the son would have acute trauma and panic. The immediate response would be the obsessive outsider would escape and conceal, and the son would shock and collapse. The thinking clarity of an obsessive outsider would be high, and the thinking clarity of the son would be very low. The planning ability of an obsessive outsider would be high, and the planning ability of the son would be severely impaired. The obsessive outsider is likely to flee, and a son being likely to flee is really rare. Obsessive outsider wouldn't call for help, but a son who has done it, calling for help is very common. And the ability to maintain composure would be high with an obsessive outsider and very low with a son. And this is also really interesting too, because when it is a son-perpetrated homicide, even when they initially try to hide it, they typically break down within hours. They usually confess. They would usually call emergency services, and they usually tell someone. It is extremely rare for an 18-year-old in emotional shock to kill a parent, conceal it successfully, maintain normal behaviour, and sustain deception, especially overnight. And the post-offence behaviour is really, really important because people can lose control in violence, but they cannot fake emotional neurological shock well. So then I looked at which offender type is more likely to escape detection for decades, because let's face it, this person has escaped detection for over 40 years. And it turns out that it would be an obsessive outsider is far more likely to evade detection long-term than family-based offenders. Now, here's why. An obsessive outsider often gets away with it because they have no obvious connection to the victim. And I thought that was a really good point, because if we're saying no obvious connection to the victim, like Brian didn't have an obvious connection to Nanette, because obviously there's someone who does have a connection with her, but maybe it's somebody that everybody is overlooking because it wasn't an obvious connection. But they would leave no direct social trail. They can blend back into daily life, and they often plan or fantasize about the act beforehand and think about escape and concealment early on before they even do anything. There's no built-in suspicion. There's no emotional attachment that draws attention. There's less psychological pressure to confess. So greater emotional detachment and more cognitive control after the crime. And these cases frequently become true cold cases, as Nanette's has. And this is why family-based offending, why they rarely get away with it. Okay, because family offenders face immediate suspicion, which Craig definitely did. I don't know if it was immediate, but I know lately he's definitely faced some suspicion. But they have high emotional exposure, they have constant observation, and they have intense internal psychological pressure. They have a psychological burden which, shows guilt, grief, fear, trauma, emotional collapse. And this usually leads to a confession or behavioural leakage, inconsistent stories, emotional breakdown, and suspicious behaviour patterns. Now, I know that some people are going to go, but Craig has inconsistent stories. And yeah, but the inconsistent stories when it comes to Craig, though, are from 30 years plus after the actual crime. So when I think inconsistent stories, I think, you get pulled down to the police station one day and you tell them a story, and then they pull you down the next week and, your story isn't quite the same. It's got a couple of details that are a little bit different. I don't call a 30-year gap an inconsistent story, because you might think, well, you know what? It was his mother that died. He should remember everything that went on. But that's not realistic. Some people are so traumatized by the death of a loved one that they do remember every single thing, and they'll probably never forget it. I mean, I'm sure Greg would never forget finding his mother out the back there. All right, that kind of trauma. I'm sure that he would remember that for the rest of his life. But Craig didn't see her. He wasn't, of course he's going to be traumatized by his mother being murdered, of course. I mean, that's a given. But he didn't see any of the details. So, 30 years later, when he's asked, about times or his movements or stuff like that, it's probably not going to be exactly the same as what he said on the first day. I'm sure he remembers a lot, and then I'm sure there's other stuff that he just doesn't remember. So I don't really put much stock in the inconsistent stories one, even though sometimes he does seem a little bit inconsistent, because the things he's inconsistent about are things that I think most people would forget over the years. And when your traumatized brain works in weird ways, that we either remember everything or remember barely nothing or remember some things and not other things. So yeah, I don't put much stock in that. But the bottom line of that, though, was that long-term evasion by young family offenders is statistically rare. But I was also thinking about the part that said that if it was an 18-year-old son, they almost always discover the body. And I thought, well, who says he didn't leave afterwards to give himself an alibi and then return to discover the body and he didn't realise that Craig was already there? I mean, he did only miss discovering the body by about 10 minutes. Right, the answer that I found to that, though, was yes, that behaviour is theoretically possible, but it is psychologically difficult, emotionally taxing, and statistically uncommon. And why is that? Because for someone to commit an extremely violent act, leave the scene, and then return deliberately to stage discovery, they would need to have very high emotional control, advanced deception capability, suppression of shock response, cognitive clarity, strong self-preservation instincts, and the ability to perform emotionally under extreme stress. And this is far more common in adult offenders than in adolescents. So looking between the two types of offenders again and the behaviour when it comes to, detection of the body and escaping detection for decades. With escaping detection for decades, an obsessive outsider, that's very likely, but with a son scenario would be uncommon. Leaving the scene and never returning is very likely for an obsessive outsider and possible for a son. Returning to stage the discovery is rare for the obsessive outsider, but possible but psychological difficult for the son. And maintaining deception long term is very likely for the obsessive outsider and very difficult for the son scenario. Sorry, I know this has been a long one, but all put together, this homicide shows a targeted, emotionally driven, escalating violence by someone with obsessive fixation and sufficient cognitive control to manage sound, movement, and escape. This profile fits a stalker-type offender far better than an impulsive domestic killing. All right, so that's it. That's all the notes that I took from all the stuff that I read. Okay, so like I said, it might not be right, but I don't know. What do you think anyway? Let me know in the comments if you think this sounds like it might be that kind of person. But this doesn't sound like Craig to me. Unless he was an exceptionally controlled 18-year-old, I just don't think he fits, especially because he didn't seem to display any of the behaviours beforehand that would suggest he was capable of doing something like this, especially when some people think that maybe he was surprised in his bedroom doing something. That doesn't explain why the car was vandalised before. I mean, then you would have to either imagine that the vandalism at the house didn't have anything to do with her murder. So we really have three options there, that the rocks, the vandalism at the house, and the murder were all committed by the same person, or the rocks were committed by one person and the vandalism at the house and the murder were committed by another person, or the rocks were committed by one person, the vandalism in the front of the house was committed by another person, and then the murder was committed by another person. And that seems statistically very unlikely. I mean, that's just, that's a total shit show going on there. Unless someone who knows him wants to write in the comments or email me to say that he actually was exhibiting this kind of behaviour, then I'm just going to leave it at that for the moment. Now, I don't know for sure if Craig did it, or I don't know for sure that he didn't do it. But based on all of this, I am moving him down on my list of suspects. So he might move back up if new information comes to light, but at the moment he's moved down quite a bit. I mean, he won't go off completely until this case is solved, and that's because no one will go off completely until we actually know who did it. Now, I've said this before, but you never know for 100% certain that anyone is innocent, and that is why everyone is on my list. Everyone. That includes all of you listening. You're all suspects, because the only person who isn't a suspect is me, because I was a small child at the time. I didn't even know where Baronia was. I was yet to develop any psychopathic tendencies, but mostly because I know for 100% certain that I didn't do it. So the only non-suspect to me is me. Okay, so sorry for the length of this, but make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and please leave your comments below, because I am just dying to hear, especially from the people who thought it was Craig. I want to know, has this changed your mind at all? Or you've just thought, nope, she doesn't know what she's talking about, which you may be right there, but she doesn't know what she's talking about. I totally still believe it's Craig, and I'm not ever going to change my mind. But I would also like to hear if it's like, wow, I thought it was Craig this whole time, but after what she said, it just doesn't seem statistically possible. I really, really, really want to hear your comments.